Okay, students, welcome back to Political Sociology. And as you can see, I am in a different location, an undisclosed location for my own safety, since I know there are forces that are interested in dragging me away for my political views. Just kidding. In any case, it's Tuesday morning. It's a little chilly out. I'm outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And I'm happy to be back talking about political sociology. And this week, the topic is class and politics. As I was thinking about this, I thought it might be a little redundant since the entire field of political sociology is essentially founded on the question of the relationship between class and politics. And we've certainly touched on this significant ways already throughout the semester, and we will continue to do that when we discuss questions about who rules the ruling class and the relationship between capitalism and democracy. So by virtue of living in a capitalist society, it's inevitable that class becomes one of the most significant, and for some people, the most significant, there's arguments about this, the most significant factor in understanding what happens politically. So let's get started. And I can't use with VoiceThread my remote mouse. So I'm going to have to move it here and advance the slides by leaning forward. Not what I like to do, but that's VoiceThread. Now, if it turns out nobody ever uses VoiceThread, and a few of you have, thank you very much. But if it turns out nobody's using VoiceThread for the purpose it's intended, which is to, as you're viewing the slides, assuming you are viewing the slides, you would pose a question or a comment or a reaction. There is another method I'm using in my intro class that's probably simpler, and it does allow me to use my remote mouse, which is important to me. Okay, what can we say about class and politics? Well, let's at least acknowledge that the most significant social theorist, in my view, of course, is Karl Marx. And we could spend an entire semester really talking about the relationship between Marx's theory, his understanding of capitalism, class, and politics. So I'm just introducing a couple concepts that you may be familiar with, you may have been exposed to in other classes, maybe social theory. So as you may recall, one thing we discussed earlier in the semester was the view of Marx in terms of the rise of capitalism and the proletarianization. That means that capitalism can only survive, can only operate if you have people who have nothing to sell but their labor power. They have no access to property, no access to independent means of subsistence. They have to work for somebody else. If you don't have a large percent of your population that falls into that category, capitalists have nobody to exploit, and you don't have capitalism. So one of the, when we talk about like social change and international development, we talk about the rise of capitalism, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, as Marxists like to talk about it. And it's a process of proletarianization, creating the proletariat. So in any case, when Marx talks about a class in itself, he's basically saying that there is objectively a huge percent of the population in all capitalist societies that are objectively working class, that are objectively being exploited because exploitation is simply a necessary condition for capitalism. So that's a class in itself, right? And we could spend a lot of time talking about this concept. Okay, so I'm skimming over something which perhaps I've spent too much time thinking about, and therefore I'm qualifying all these things, right? So a class in itself, you have, a certain percentage, clearly the vast, vast majority of people in the United States sell their labor power for a wage, right? Even these people in the middle strata, the middle class, this contradictory class locations, those things we talked about. Now, the point is, just because you're objectively working class does not mean that you have class consciousness, that you understand that your class position exists in antagonism, in tension with, in opposition, in conflict with other classes, particularly if you're working class, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. So the key to what we would regard as class politics, where you're mobilizing people around the issue of class, would be moving from a class in itself, that is, you have a class structure, to a class for itself, where that class structure translates into political struggle. So when Marx talked about class consciousness, it's class consciousness that's required to translate a class in itself to a class for itself. Some of you made reference to the term hegemony, or hegemony, however you want to pronounce it, a cultural, ideological hegemony. And of course, this is a way to penetrate the consciousness of people in capital societies. And if you have a dominant ruling class, ideological hegemony, what we call ideology, right? This will thwart, and is intentionally designed to thwart, the extent to which workers develop class consciousness. So we made reference to restraining myths, beliefs about the way the society works, which makes it less likely that people are going to engage in radical political activity, which might both question and ultimately overturn the existing arrangements. And that ideology is extremely powerful. And we talked about neoliberalism as one aspect of that. Okay, so I just wanted to say something about this idea of class in itself, class for itself. How do you translate one into the other? This is the big, big, big question for those who want to mobilize the working class around class politics. So a few little items I wanted to mention with regard to this. Some of these we sort of touched on before, but in the context of having a discussion about class and politics. As you know, most people don't like to talk about class in the United States. There was a time when, well, we really don't have social classes. It's a middle class society, middle majority. We talked about that. You read about that in the first week. Some of you found that topic, that concept, that middle majority concept, very interesting. And the idea is, we live in a middle class society. And if you listen to the rhetoric and the language of most people who are talking politically, they rarely talk about the working class. They talk about the middle class. We want everyone to have an opportunity to live a middle class lifestyle. And Biden is currently putting out an ad, and I had some criticism of this that I posted on Facebook, where he's promoting middle class values. Biden represents middle class values. And there is a racial element to this notion of middle class values. I won't go into it now, but the point is, all of the focus tends to be on this middle class, this amorphous, difficult to define, often more associated with lifestyle than with one's actual position in the realm of the economic system, the social relations of production. That is, at least from a Marxist perspective, how you define class. You don't define class by how much money you make. You don't define class by where you live, if you live in a suburb. You don't define class by the commodities you own. From a Marxist perspective, you define it by whether or not you sell your labor power for a wage, or you own property that provides you with independent income, not requiring you to go out and sell your labor power for wage. Where do we see class and politics, right? Because we don't really see it in the political system. We've talked about this. We have this two-party system. The two-party system is dominated largely by corporate interests. Both parties are dominated by corporate interests. When we talked about labor last week, we talked about the fact that, why is there more labor activity, union membership in Canada versus the United States? Okay. Same kind of thing. We ended up talking about organization and political party. One place where you do see some sharp class differences between voters and non-voters. And again, you all read an article about this. If non-voters voted, if they were mobilized, if they had an incentive to vote, okay, I'm not going to shame them for not voting, then you would probably have a much different kind of political policy landscape. Because the people who don't vote tend to be working class, less educated, would have an economic interest in progressive, dare I say, radical political social democratic policies. And voters tend to be more highly educated, wealthier, and therefore you have some notion of class politics, but it's between voters, non-voters. By the way, just to make this point clear, we have a two-party system versus European countries. You can even include Canada here, okay, because they have the New Democratic Party, so they have something of a multiple party system. Certainly they have a viable third party. Where you have multiple parties, unlike the United States, you tend to see not only higher levels of voting and political participation, but you do not see the sharp class distinction between voters and non-voters. So think about the role of these institutions, party institutions, right? And that brings me to the next point, no working class or labor party. We have no working class or labor party. So some people say class produces party. Some people actually say it's party organization that produces class. What do you mean by produces class? Class consciousness. Or, as we made reference to last week, the class idea that exists in Canada. The other aspect of American politics, which tends to minimize the effect of class in the way we like to think about in terms of economic terms, is that there's a great deal of focus between the two parties, not so much on economic issues and the organization of the economy. Remember, they're both neoliberal parties, but there's an emphasis on the cultural issues. And that tends to confound the relationship between social class and the political party one identifies with. So you see working class people identifying with the Republican Party, not because they agree with the Republican Party necessarily on economic issues, but because the economic debates and questions about how to organize the economy are off the table, and all we're left with are cultural issues, the social issues, on which the working class tends to be more conservative. So if the Democrats actually wanted to be really successful, they would be focusing much more on economic issues. There are probably reasons why they don't do that. We'll talk about that. We also have in the United States, you can't rule this out. This is a whole nother conversation, and later we will have some readings on race and politics. But in the United States, race has divided the working class. This is a deliberate policy by the capitalist class, by the ruling class, to try to create divisions within the working class, which makes it harder for the working class to mobilize. And so this gets us into the whole issue of identity politics, universal policies, which would be applicable to all rather than means tested. I mean, we'll talk more about that as we get into the semester. But unified working class political party doesn't exist at all. And I've just touched on a few of the aspects of that. Okay, so this is what we would expect. I think we've talked about this already. And the right party would essentially mobilize and draw support from the wealthy, the rich, The middle, whatever the middle is, okay, and I'm going to use that term right now just for the sake of this graphic illustration. Some may go right, some may go left, but the working class goes left, right? Now, this is if you have a left party and a right party. Right? Now, what does that mean? In the United States, we sometimes say, well, the Democrats are left and the Republicans are right, but hopefully you understand how narrow the differences are in many ways between the two parties. And we only have two, right? We don't have a working class party. We don't have a labor party. So there really isn't a left party. There's a party where presumably the left has no choice but to go there because they're not going to go to the right wing party. Well, we know what happened there because working class people, in fact, do support the right party in the United States, and that is the Republicans. All right, so I'm just laying this out conceptually, graphically. So we've already talked about this quite a bit, but we have no left party. We have two-party convergence on neoliberalism. This has essentially been the case since the 80s. And so under these conditions where, voters perceive, working class voters perceive that, one party comes, one party goes, I don't really see any significant difference in the way they're pursuing economic policies that is impacting me as a working class person, then, of course, the sociocultural issues become more salient. That becomes the major dividing point between the two parties. And as I said before, working class people, while they're economically left, they tend to be, on average, socially and culturally conservative. And if they don't perceive a difference on the economic dimension, then the Republicans have shrewdly, cleverly lured them on the basis of, what do we say, God's guns and gays, the social cultural issues, and there's many more, right? Immigration, all these other kinds of things. So, the Democratic Party has essentially ceded the working class, to the Republican Party because of the focus on cultural issues. And then what you get are the working class, and I'm not saying all working class people move to the Republican Party, but in this dynamic, working class people may be moving to the right in ways you wouldn't normally expect, theoretically. And you've got people in the middle, again, moving both ways. But you have the highly educated professional class, professional managerial class, PMC as it's called, moving to the Democratic Party, largely because they're more liberal, right, on social and cultural issues based on their education. All right, I think that's one of the most significant things you need to understand about the current state of American politics. Okay, well, where is there some class differences? What I would say is, and I actually put this together during the 2020 campaign primary for the Democratic Party, and you can see that I have here two wings of the party. So there actually is class voting, fairly sharp class division within the Democratic Party today. Much of this is a result of the consequences of the Obama administration, the frustration that people had during that period after the great financial crisis, the rise of Occupy Wall Street as a social movement, and ultimately Bernie Sanders within the Democratic Party organizing people around a social democratic left-leaning political program that attracted great support from the working class. Right? This is not the constituency that the Democratic Party is necessarily interested in mobilizing. We could say more about that, but Sanders was. On the other side, you've got the progressive neoliberals. We use that term, the Nancy Fraser term. We're going to go back to that as well. Buttigieg, I sort of put him in that category. I had some friends who thought Buttigieg was a great candidate. I had, not my kind of candidate at all. I have no regard for the guy in any way. But I can see how he would be attractive to the professional, highly educated class given his pedigree, given his biography, given the way he speaks and talks. So we do see some sharp class divisions with the Democratic Party. I don't know how all this is going to shake out. Last time I said I thought there would be a realignment, and I think it's going to be the progressive neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party will essentially be the Democratic Party. It has largely been the Democratic Party before. But what I'm saying is they will continue to dominate. And it looks like they're attracting people who are alienated from what has become an extreme right-wing Republican Party. They'll join together. And I think the progressive Social Democrats will be out in the cold. And therefore, they held a third party, People's Party convention recently to talk about what it would mean to have a third party. You should know now, if you read Lee Drutman's piece on the two-party doom loop, that you're not going to have a successful third party in the United States, or viable third party, until you change the electoral system away from the single member district, winner take all, first past the post electoral model. But people are talking about it. And that's a good thing, because we need more parties. We certainly need a third, a fourth, a fifth party. I would support all of that, where people can actually identify a party that represents their interests, rather than year after year, national election after national election, lesser of two evils. Lesser of two evils. This is not, promoting democratic vitality. Okay. I get carried away with these things. Let's see if I can move this next one. There we go. I don't know if you can. Let's put it over there. That's good. All right, let's put it over there. Okay, so this was a graph. Thomas Ferguson is a political scientist, somebody who I have enormous respect for. He developed the investment theory of politics, and he's been doing a lot of analysis on the debate between whether whether Trump's support was a function of racial resentment, or whether it had to do with economic insecurity and hardship. And he tends to focus more on the social class economic aspect. But here you can see the point we're trying to make, where the Democratic Party is divided by social class, where we're looking at the relationship between the, let's make sure that we have this median household income in these various towns, okay, and the vote for Sanders. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about this level of analysis data, okay, because these little dots here are not people, okay, they're towns, and this is data aggregated to that town level. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. But this is simply some of the analysis that's being done by people like Ferguson, showing that there are some significant class cleavages, if you like, class differences, class divisions within the Democratic Party. So I like his work, and I wanted to share that with you. And you can go to the source. I have the link there. If you read Richard Florida's article, Richard Florida has kind of a long history of developing some interesting ideas, some of which turn out to be somewhat problematic. One was there was an analysis he was doing, maybe 15 years ago, where he was looking, 10 to 15 years ago, where he was looking at the relationship between the characteristics of urban areas and the extent to which they were attracting jobs in high-paying, high-technology sectors. And he came across a very interesting finding, and I'll just bring this up because I think it's interesting, and it also poses some methodological questions. And that is, he found that one of the strongest predictors of whether a city, an urban area, a region, attracted high-tech industry jobs was the percent of the population that was gay. Now, it's kind of an intriguing finding, right? So what was going on there? Why did he find this strong correlation between the percentage of the population gay in the city, the urban area, and the attraction of jobs, the high-tech sector, good, well-paying jobs? Now, in my data analysis class, we sort of talk about this as a spurious relationship. It's not that, having a population of gay citizens in your city automatically produces an increase in the number of good jobs. Rather, these two things are correlated with something else, right? And what he found was it had to do with the larger climate and environment that existed in these cities. In these cities where there were lots of cultural amenities, there was good restaurants, there were museums, there typically was often an institution of higher education located in proximity. And so the key was that if you wanted to attract industry, high-tech industry, at that time, that's what every city was trying to recruit because they bring good jobs, high-paying jobs, lots of tax revenue. If you wanted to attract them, you had to understand that they would only locate facilities. They would only bring their workers to someplace. They could only recruit their workers to someplace that had a certain political and social climate, right? And that political social climate is reflected in lots of cultural, social amenities, as well as, and I have the 3 T's there, so I just want to point. He said the key to urban economic development is talent, okay, technology, and tolerance. Tolerance, okay. That is, these highly educated workers are very liberal, and they do not want to, nor would the company that locates there be able to attract them to a location that was reactionary and conservative. Now, when I talk about this, I often mention, oh, by the way, when I first moved to Jacksonville, somebody told me that the most powerful institution in Jacksonville was the First Baptist Church. Case closed. Okay? You understand? If that is the most powerful organization, institution in Jacksonville, we ain't going to be recruiting these industries and these workers. This is not the kind of place they're going to want to be. Now, of course, Jacksonville, has changed over time, and hopefully there's a little more tolerance. But that has something to do with the fact that this is not a high-tech mecca at all. We've never been able to attract those kinds of jobs. So he was interested in this, and he got a lot of prominence. And he was invited by all of these urban planners and mayors to come and tell them, how could we, resuscitate our city? And he pointed to his model of the creative class, right? He called these the talented people. He called them the creative class, highly educated, mental labor, highly educated professionals. You want to bring them to your city. Now, what ultimately happened, I'll just tell you how the story ended because it's kind of interesting. And Richard Florida is a decent human being. He's a good guy. But what happened was a lot of the cities and the urban areas that followed his development prescription ultimately went down the road of gentrification. So city after city that tried to institute what Richard Florida was recommending ultimately ended up gentrifying neighborhoods, pushing out working class citizens in that community, displacing them, and creating this kind of highly gentrified, high cost of living, high cost of housing communities. And there was kind of a backlash against Richard Florida. And he actually came out and did sort of a mea culpa and said, you know what, I realized that what I was proposing has, you can use the great sociological concept, unintended consequences or unanticipated consequences. He didn't think that would place. So when you read his article, he's looking at the relationship between the dominant occupations in different states, and the political leaning of that state, right? So occupation, what occupations dominate, and is the state Democratic, Republican? He uses the term red and blue. Yeah. And of course, he talks about this class party inversion issue that was discussed by Lane Kenworthy in his article, and that is that states that seem to have the highest per capita income, and of course, that's related to certain kinds of occupations. Oh, you tend to see that they go to the Democratic Party, and working class states tend to go, lower income states tend to go to the Republican Party, right? And so the key dynamic there, as many of you identified in your reading and writing assignment, is education, the liberalizing effect of education. Now, I just wanted to make one methodological caution here, and this is something I always talk about in my data analysis class. I'm going to bring it up here because it's important. I just mentioned a spurious relationship between the percentage gay and the increase in the percentage of jobs in technology in an urban area. You have to be, that's a spurious problem. We have a different problem here. It's called the ecological fallacy. And what this means is that when you are looking at the relationship between variables at a level of analysis above the individual, right? So we have survey data, right? That's individual level data. And then we do collect data for cities, counties, states, right? And we find correlations like what percent of, is there a correlation between the percent of the population in professional managerial occupations and a percentage of the vote Democratic? For the states, is there a correlation there? And of course, Florida's whole analysis is based on that. The ecological fallacy is that even though you see a correlation between the percentage of professional managerial occupations, workers in professional managerial occupations in a state, and the percent voting Democratic, you cannot infer from that. I guess you could infer, but you cannot conclude that it was professional managerial class workers who were voting Democratic. That's all you can say is in a state that has a high level of professional managerial occupations and workers, you have a high level of voting or higher level of voting for the Democratic Party, because this is not individual level data, right? So we can't infer to the individual level. That's the ecological fallacy. Right? And people make this mistake all the time. Like you'll see a correlation between the percentage of poverty in a state and the crime rate. That doesn't mean that poor people are the ones committing the crime. You cannot infer that because the data that you have based that correlation on is not individual level data, it's state level data. Okay, so that's something that I think Florida needs to be very careful with when he does his analyses. And sometimes I think he's a little sloppy there. All right. Okay. You have read a chapter or two from Piston's book. This is a book I came across last year. He's a political scientist, and I'm going to give more credit to political scientists because they're beginning to do what I think is sociological work. What took him so long? So Piston is trying to show that, in fact, class is a very, very salient factor in American politics. Now, he's looking at it a little differently. Okay? He's not looking at it the way maybe Marx would look at it, that the working class has certain kinds of attitudes, right? And they develop class consciousness, and that translates into radical political activity. That's really not how he's entering this question of class and politics in the United States. Right? What he's looking at is the extent to which people have attitudes positively or negatively toward the rich and the poor. Okay? And what the consequences of that are. And I actually was surprised to find in his analysis, and he utilizes a wide range of survey data. to establish his points. And hopefully you read this, or you will read it, and you'll appreciate it. The extent to which, I was surprised the extent to which there are these kinds of differences, particularly sympathy for the poor. Okay. So sympathy for the poor, resentment of the rich. Okay. So people think about the social world in these kinds of class terms based on his survey data, right? So I'm going to spend a lot of time on these charts, but I'll let you look at them. There's lots of different methods that we use in surveys, and there is one survey that he spent a lot of time drawing from, and it's a survey that has open-ended questions. That's not common in your typical survey. Usually it's, you make a statement like, rich people deserve to be taxed more highly. Just a statement, right? And then people can agree or disagree with that. And of course, he looks at that kind of data too. But he also dug into what we would call more qualitative data, open-ended question that asks people talking about poor, when people start talking about the poor, it produces a dislike for Republicans and a like for Democrats. Okay? You understand? So when people start thinking about the situation of the poor, poverty, sympathy for them, this translates, okay, this kind of class talk, if you want to call it that, rich versus poor, that's the kind of class talk he's referring to, translates into advantages for one party or the other, right? And talking about the rich produces the same kind of pattern. So that's the basis of the book. Now, he goes into all kinds of detail, various explanations for why, there isn't more class political activity in the United States. But this sort of gets at the heart. And so what I'm putting in the slides are these tables, which I don't remember if each one of these tables was in the chapters you read. So I'm just trying to provide you with a little more information about what he did. Okay. Now, this is the more common way to go about putting together the survey with a closed-ended question where you say, do the poor have more or less money than they deserve? And then you give people choices, right? It's not an open-ended question. They have to choose a lot more, somewhat more, slightly more, the right amount, slightly less, somewhat less, a lot less. Notice the construction of this survey item is designed to produce as much variation, which is very important if you're going to do statistical analysis, as much variation as possible, so that you have quantitative differences, a lot more, the high end, a lot less, the low end, but you have all of these intermediate levels in between. Okay, so take a look at this. If these were not included in the chapters you read, they ask the same question: do the rich have more or less money than they deserve? Okay, very interesting survey results there. Okay, so I'm going to let you spend some time looking at these, making sense of them, thinking about it. Some of you may be interested in going to graduate school, maybe in political science, maybe in sociology, to get a flavor for some of the things you can do. And remember, these surveys, he didn't create these surveys. These are surveys that are done nationally. Everyone has access to them. In my class, we use the General Social Survey. And then you can access these surveys and answer interesting questions like these. Okay? So I hope that some of you will think about that. Or maybe when you're taking the methods class or the data analysis class in sociology or the one in political science, that you might explore some question with the existing surveys that you're using in that class, which is what we do in data analysis. All right, so again, Piston is actually making a kind of political argument in the sense that, or at least one infers from his work, that If the Democrats want to be successful, they need to start talking about rich and poor. They need to start talking about class. All right? I want you to think about that. And that brings me to an article that came out by Eric Levitz. He writes great stuff on the political landscape in the United States. Always insightful. And basically, Levitz, he read the Piston book, and you can find this article online. And based on that, he said Democrats must reach out to moderates in 2020 by waging a vicious class war. Right. Now, remember, only in American politics, if somebody says, you know what, the rich need to pay a higher tax, will somebody say, oh, you're waging a class war, right? I mean, this is the unsophisticated level of American politics, right? Class war. I was joking when I created this slide back in, I guess, last year, led by billionaire Michael Bloomberg, right? I was being facetious. Bloomberg, remember, he ran in the Democratic primary, and just this week, he has indicated that he is going to invest, I don't know, is it $1 million, $1 billion? I don't even remember. Massive amounts of money on ads in Florida against Donald Trump. So if you want Trump out of office and, you want Biden to win, you might view this as something positive that he's going to invest all this money. But what does it really say about the nature of American politics when the billionaire has to come forward with massive amounts of his own money to somehow shape the results of the election? Right? We talk about Russian meddling. We never talk about the meddling that takes place routinely, legally, in our political system. Money, my friends. Okay. If you're going to make a pitch to voters on the basis of class, wealth, privilege, concentration of power, this is called populism. And unfortunately, and this Trump has a lot to do with this, although there's a historical way in which, particularly in the American context, populism has been discussed. There's a distortion of what populism means. And I would strongly recommend that you, and you did read a couple articles by Thomas Frank from Listen Liberal. Thomas Frank just wrote another book. I'm in the process of reading it. It's called The People Know. And it's a history of populism in the United States, but it's also largely an indictment of the Democratic Party's failure to embrace populism, because the Democratic Party associates populism with, as I say, right-wing reactionary demagogues like Trump, racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. They all associate this with populism. They assume that the population, the people, harbor these kinds of attitudes. And therefore, we should essentially minimize the level of participation to some extent of these, what did Hillary call them, deplorables, right? So what he points out is that if you look at American history, if you look at the history of populism in the United States, it involves the progressive mobilization of people. That's really what populism is. The mobilization, when you think about democracy, it is about the mobilization of the people, the demos, the people, against inequality, against the concentration of wealth and corporate power, and institutionalized systems of exploitation. Why wouldn't the Democratic Party take advantage of the fact that, and as revealed in the research by Piston, that you can mobilize people when you make reference to rich, poor, and play on, okay, you could say that, the fact that people do have some resentment about the concentration of wealth and power in the United States. Was any of that mentioned during the Democratic convention? They were too busy inviting Republicans in to support Biden. So, this is a question in terms of political strategy and the viability of the political parties to even engage in this kind of thing. Obviously, we have a certain kind of right-wing populism. Let me just mention some of these terms. Somebody came up with this wonderful term, pluto populism, which this person was trying to describe a Trumpian right-wing populism. And basically, plutocrat, right? That's the rich, the wealthy, the owner class, the capitalist class, plutocracy, whatever you want to call it. Ruled by the rich, ruled by the wealthy. This author, I can't remember his name, but he threw out this term pluto populism. Basically, what that means is that you mobilize people around issues like immigration, or you tell them you're going to cut taxes and that kind of stuff because that's good for them. But ultimately, the populism, you're generating support for yourself, but ultimately, you're instituting policies that almost exclusively benefit the wealthy. So the Tax Reform Act of 2017 under Trump would be a classic example of pluto populism. You phrase it in the context of, less government, cutting taxes, giving people back the money they deserve, and then you put in place a tax reform bill which disproportionately benefits the top 10% of the population, right? Going back to Nancy Fraser, you read one of her articles. She talked about reactionary populism. Yes, there are forms of reactionary populism, but there's progressive populism. Democratic Party is afraid of populism, afraid of the people. The people know. So as I said, Democrats reject populism. Populist appeals would bring many working class people back to the Democratic Party that have moved over to the Republican Party, because the Republican Party does appeal in ways to the working class, in ways, even though they obviously have no interest in promoting the interest of the work, they can appeal to them, right? I don't know, the Democratic Party thinks they're above all that kind of thing. Right? So why don't they do it? Well, you could say it's this irrational fear of populism, right? This association of populism with reactionary right-wing demagogues. Or you could say, well, even though they might win some elections that way, maybe the 2020 election, the constituency that supports the Democratic Party financially has no interest in promoting those kinds of appeals or policies, because it threatens their political, economic security. Right? Calling out the financial sector. I mean, that would be a wonderful kind of populist appeal that would have massive, massive levels of support among the population. You don't hear a word about it. Well, the Democratic Party relies heavily on donors in the financial sector, what we call the financial oligarchy, right? And you saw this earlier presentation I made when Kamala Harris was selected. Wall Street, sigh of relief. Thank goodness. We know Biden's on our side. We weren't so sure who he's going to pick as a vice. Okay, Kamala Harris. Everything's okay. We will continue to provide the Democratic Party with the money. And Bloomberg? Come on. Bloomberg represents Wall Street. Okay. I don't know what to say. Who dared to say this? Okay, this is something you don't hear in American politics. This person said, if there is going to be class warfare in this country, it's about time the working class won the war. Because remember, we've had neoliberalism since the late 1970s, early 1980s. It's been a class war, my friends. And the working class has gotten their ass kicked on every possible measure of working class quality of life. Somebody said, it's about time the working class won. This is class struggle language. This is class conflict language. I'm going to let you guess who you think that was who said this. Want me to tell you? Some of you may know. It's Bernie Sanders. Remember, we said that division, that class division within the Democratic Party, quite significant. You will not hear this language from Biden. You will not hear this language from Harris. You will not hear this language from Pelosi or Schumer or any of those members of the Democratic Party establishment. And I think there's going to be a price to be paid for this fear of populism, failure to address the hardship that many Americans have been suffering and continue to suffer. And of course, during this period of COVID-19, you would think this would be the perfect opportunity to propose the most aggressive, bold agenda to restructure economic production, the organization of the political economy, massive investment of the New Deal sort. It's the only thing that's going to really get us out of this economic depression over the long run. We don't hear much about that. All right. I think I'm going to stop here because VoiceThread does cut me off at 60 minutes and I'm at 52. So I want to add a second section to this lecture, which shifts a little bit away from the class and politics and talks about this idea of generational effects. And Lane Kenworthy, and some of you mentioned this in your reading and writing assignment, made reference to post-materialist values. And I want to talk a little bit about the origin of that idea that comes out of the work of Ronald Inglehart, and some of the ways that perhaps that concept doesn't apply the way he thought it would, and the way it might actually be applied today in some kind of unexpected ways. So I'll do that in the second half. For now, I will say goodbye and thank you for listening.